the invitation di nangwa ani nangko sumju today da ni tring de jigang la mimanyum do jeto wa di kogap so di nga tu chinang shubi ani nga de New York la preparing to the community in the event thing hanguni 얘기 지금이 콜라 먹고 코뉴와 아니 페이스북 다 이제는 빠르게 코뉴 대기 events 다 community events weddings cultural dancing that is sama tonya and the thing that real in person letwa 아니 tour de the sama nang towa the sama 통도 가라 나랑 소소세바 빼가운 차기도 아니 미망 다 아니 대 간주기 규례 참마 촉촉도 참마 페멜렌조 주시간도 의상 그때 속바 먹고 열어 기도 먹고 열어 참마 기원의 장내 가주 그르낭 와다 community 라 가주 첩시낭 와디 service 디낭 와디 나랑 기디 fruits 된서 상마 통도 아니 된서 상마 나와디랑 안닝 타고디 도시남 슈니 the 드링 얘기 가르치면서나 나 인지토네 셰초와치 So what I thought I would share with all of you today is my journey, how I got into politics and where I am today. And through that journey, the experience that I have had, and most importantly, the lessons that I have learned. And it is my hope, especially because today's event is aimed at interacting with the youth of New York and New Jersey. I hope that I can impart my experiences and the lessons I've learned so that you may be able to draw on some of them if that is useful. And after that, I think that maybe we will keep some more time for a Q&A session. I would love to take questions from you if anyone has anything they're interested in learning more about me, especially if it's something that I have not shared already. I'm happy to take more questions at the end. Okay, let me start. So everybody knows that in 2018, I got elected to public office in Canada, more specifically in Toronto, Ontario, to the Legislative Assembly. And the day I was elected, that evening, it was major news. You know, I remember I was exhausted from the campaigning and the celebrations that night, which was wonderful. I have great memories of it, but mostly I was extremely tired from the campaigning. But there was such a media frenzy. I went to bed around, I think like past midnight, and I woke up to hundreds and hundreds of messages, including many from the media. It was not only covered in local Canadian papers and in Canadian TV, but also internationally. I learned the next day that it was even trending on Twitter. So clearly, it was historic. It was something that everybody was paying attention to. And so as the media started to approach me, and not just media actually, a lot of people who had never known who I was, were hearing from me or about me from the first time because of the election, they started to ask questions. And I remember doing a number of interviews, and often the question used to be, how did you get politically involved? What led you to this day, this role? And I think as a Tibetan, how do you get politically involved is a very complex question. It's not very straightforward to answer. And I knew what they meant in terms of how did I get politically involved. They think mainstream Canadian politics, which in my discussions, in my conversations, I refer to as electoral politics. But there is also the overall, more general politics, the politics of our daily life. And to that, I always say, well, I'm Tibetan. I was born political. And we all know that. I mean, somebody like me, I was born in Nepal. The fact that I was born in Nepal and not in Tibet, where my parents and my grandparents were born, itself is because of politics. The fact that I was born away from the land of my ancestors, but also I would never ever have the same rights as everybody else born in Nepal. I would never have a pathway to citizenship and residency because of who I was, a Tibetan refugee, a stateless person. That is politics. So politics, especially for us as Tibetans, is part of our life, is part of our identity. And so when you say, you probably hear this phrase, the personal is political, that is so true for Tibetans. Our whole life, our existence is dictated by politics. And so I always try and I really emphasize, I don't just answer their question. I always tell people what it means to be political, especially as a Tibetan. And then I go into, okay, I know what you mean. How did I get involved in Canadian politics or mainstream politics? And for me, you know, a lot of people heard about me in 2018, and I'm sure many of you heard about me for the first time in 2018 when I got elected. But I didn't come out of nowhere. You know, it didn't just happen like that. There is a history behind it, right? So for me, for example, I was very active locally in the community. As was mentioned by the Tsotso, I was active with Students for Free Tibet Canada. I also served on the executive of our local association there, the Canadian Tibetan Association of Ontario, as well as the Tibetan Canadian Cultural Center. So I was active in the community in general. But through my activism, as an extension of my community work, I realized it is very important for me to get involved in mainstream Canadian politics. I was lobbying, doing a lot of advocacy work to Canadian elected officials, right? And as the community numbers started to grow, as the community began to get more settled and understand how the system works, I realized rather than have somebody else speak on our behalf, we can speak for ourselves. And that's how I got involved. But the journey to it took almost 10 years. My first involvement with a Canadian political party, I belong to a party called the New Democratic Party. We are a socially democratic party, was in 2009. So between 2009 and 2018, I worked on campaigns. I worked in political office. I worked within the party. It was a lot of hard work, which was behind the scenes. And that journey is what led me to the position of being not only confident in taking that step to run for political office, but also with the knowledge, the skills, the expertise, but most importantly, the relationships. Because nobody can run for public office on their own. You have to do it with community support. So that foundation had been built for almost a decade with housing activists, with climate activists, so many community associations in the district, we call it riding in Canada, in the district that I was going to represent. And of course, the district also includes the Tibetan community. So I think that what I learned from that, and I want to share with all of you, is there's no shortcut. You have to do the work, hard work behind the scenes that maybe nobody will notice, but it is all adding up, it's all leading to something. Oftentimes when we see great success or when we see people achieving great things, it didn't happen overnight. There's been a lot of sweat, tears, sacrifice, doubt. You doubt yourself sometimes. It's like a roller coaster ride. And that's how you get there. And when I did win in my first term, the first election, I got 60% of the vote, which was from my district unprecedented. And in my second election, most recently last year, my re-election, I got about 55% of the vote. And it was the highest number of votes received by any elected official in Toronto. And the reason why I'm sharing the percentage is because if I had won by a very narrow margin, if I had won by a few percentage points, then I don't have as strong a mandate from the people to do the work ahead, right? So let's say, the foundation, and when you have the solid backing of your constituency, then you can focus ahead on achieving also a lot of protection. Can't find the right word. I would say immunity in some ways to what we call political waves, right? Or even political attacks. Because the fact that you are in a political role and that there are many actors in that space means you're, of course, exposing yourself to critiques, you're exposing yourself to attacks, but to be able to weather through it and persevere and move forward, you need that strong foundation. You need that strong mandate from your constituency. And it was even funny because I remember it was not too recently, I got interviewed by a Tibetan news outlet, I won't mention which, and that was because last year in the House, I got elected as the Deputy Speaker. And, of course, it was something that I was very humbled to get support because it needed the support from representatives of the House that belong to all political parties, not just my party. I needed support from everybody. And to be able to do that, gave me a sense that the work that I was doing was something that was resonating with people from all political stripes. But the question that I got from the Tibetan outlet was also, oh my gosh, Bhutila, how did you do it? Like Deputy Speaker in just your second term? And again, most people didn't know or didn't hear that there was a whole journey, 5 years while I was being in my first term when I was an elected representative. So my first year, I served as the deputy whip for the party. Then I became you know what a whip is, right? Like you have to make sure your party is able to deliver the votes for every piece of legislation or motion that is coming before the House. So to really try and make sure that from our side, we're able to proceed according to plan. It's really chasing after people, making sure that our position is one that is united and one that we take after consultation with all members of our caucus. And then the second, after that, I served as the vice chair of the Standing Committee of Social Policy. And so every piece of legislation that is brought before the House gets debated twice. And then after the second vote, if it succeeds the second vote, it goes to the committee for a closer examination. And in that, it's a smaller committee of representatives. And through that committee, we are able to do public consultations, hear from experts, stakeholders, make changes, amendments to the legislation if needed. And then only after all of that is done and the committee decides to support it, then it makes it back to the floor of the House for a final vote before it becomes law. So the committee is a very, very important role. There are lots and lots of legislations that gets passed until it reaches the committee, and at the committee stage is where majority of them get stuck, because not everything can become law, and so the committee plays a very important role. And I served as the vice chair for that committee. But not only that, during my first term, I knew, there were a lot of expectation, a high expectation, lots of eyes on me, especially because my election was such a news item. And I honestly felt a lot of pressure. And so I did what I knew I had to do and what I did best, which is just work hard and really strive every day to be focused and move ahead in what I had set out to do. That effort, and I was recognized as best MPP 3 years in a row, and also voted best local politician by Toronto Star, which is the largest newspaper in Canada. So I told a reporter, do you know all of this has happened? All of the work has happened in the years. I didn't just become deputy speaker out of nowhere, people can get lucky for sure, but in a lot of very meaningful work in positions of power, those things don't just happen. There's a lot of effort that goes behind it. The other thing I wanted to share is, even before, for example, I got to win my first election. And I'll give you an idea in terms of timeline. 2018 is when I got elected. But to win my party's nomination, here we call it primaries, right? That happened in 2017. I decided to put forward my name and run for office first to secure my party nomination in 2016. So just to even get to that process, after making the decision to run, took almost 2 years, right? So these are just some of my experiences, and I wanna say to a lot of the youth who are here, in any career, in anything you do in life, it requires hard work. And don't be afraid of working hard. And there will be a long time sometimes, hopefully not so long. And every generation we want to try to fasten that, right? But there will be times when you feel like you don't know where this is heading, or you don't know if that goal might be achieved. But if you persevere, you move forward, that day will come. Like I said, who knew when I first got active in politics that I would get elected, but that it would happen almost after 10 years. The second thing I wanted to share is, because I am in elected office, I have come to recognize and almost confirm the importance of every person, especially young people, getting involved in electoral politics. And that doesn't mean that everybody has to pursue public office. If that's something that you want to do, absolutely, I would encourage you to keep pursuing that. But even if your professional life, your dreams are something different, you could be in business, you could be in healthcare. No matter what it is, politics intersects with your life in every aspect. For example, the fact, let's say in the Tibetan community, there are lots of nurses, right? We certainly have a lot of nurses in the Tibetan community in Canada. The healthcare system, the conditions, the working conditions of healthcare workers, of nurses, is dictated by the government. The wages of healthcare workers is dictated by the government, right? There's so much of every aspect of your work life that is also dictated by politics that you have to get involved if you want to make an impact and if you want to improve those working conditions, the living conditions of you, your family, and of your community. Politics is everywhere. It's in our lives. It's our daily lives. So it's very important to be cognizant of that and to get involved. And I would say the most, perhaps, like obviously to do it at every level of government. So I think here in the United States, you have your senator, you have your congressperson, and then you have many levels at the state and further down, right? Similarly for us. In fact, don't just focus on the highest ranking elected official of your area. I would encourage you to go grassroots up. You know, who is your, I don't know what the lowest, not the lowest, but the closest level is. For example, in Canada, in Toronto, our closest level is the school board. So even at the school board level, that person is elected to represent the families, the students of the schools of the area. And then we have our local city councillor, and then it goes forward, right? I would say get in there from the most closest level to you. That grassroots effort is extremely important, not only because it impacts your life and it impacts our community members' lives, but in many ways, those are the people who you have easiest access to, right? Because they are people in your community. They're not someone who's in Washington, D.C., for example. And so having that and then growing with each of the elected officials as their political life and careers move forward, to make those connections at the grassroots level is extremely important. So starting local. The other aspect of that is do not just focus on one very specific day to do a lobbying for example. I know that here in the United States, there's lobby day and everybody goes down to Washington to meet their representatives and talk about the issue. That's extremely important. We have to continue that. But don't make it just a one-day event, once a year event. Lobbying, or what I like to call advocacy, is year-round. It's not a one-time effort, it's year-round. And most importantly, while we, of course, want to advocate on the issue of Tibet, our advocacy must also intersect with many aspects of our community's lives. So while we might call for certain resolutions in the House, to call for support, we also want to make sure that our elected representatives know we care for everything else that's happening in our community. And that we care not only just for Tibetan community members, but we care for everybody in our neighborhoods, the entire constituency. So that year-round advocacy is very, very important. And that's also how you can really make your mark as an advocate, as an activist in your constituencies with your elected representatives. One thing I want to say is While I was active with the local Tibetan community, and now still, but in a slightly different capacity, I have tried my very best to really focus on the strengths we have as a community. And I have come to know more about divisions within our community. You know, there are all sorts of things that we think of as barriers within the community. We think of as walls. But in reality, as I said yesterday at March 10th event, we're all Tibetan. From the moment we're born till we die, we're Tibetan. That's all we need to know. You don't have to, you know, think about different, I mean, certainly I would encourage people to preserve, maintain, and even strengthen our respective cultural traditions within the Tibetan community. But first and foremost, we are Tibetan. Because think about it, when somebody else is interacting with you, do they care which region you're from? Do they care which, what specific lineage or whatever it is? I don't even know the different aspects within the Tibetan community. I'm trying to just focus on us as one. That's extremely important. And I think that everybody should absolutely pay attention to the politics of Tibet and Tibetan issues, but really, rather than spending so much of our time and effort internally, we have to think about how do we push forward externally. That's what I have found, especially as an elected representative now, and I find that the trend is growing where we're too focused internally. And that's something that is going to make our journey to freedom, the road to justice, much harder and so much longer if we're spending our energy and time with internal divisions. So that's one request that I have for everybody, regardless of age. The other thing is, as I mentioned, you start locally, you focus on issues that impact not just the Tibetan community, but your entire constituency. And I'll tell you why. Not just because it's important, but not just because we're all human beings. We want to be good, we want to care for one another and our neighbors, but it's also strategic. Tibetan communities, no matter where we are, and especially I would say in the United States and in Canada, we're growing, certainly, that's good, but we are still relatively small, right? So for example, the constituency that I represent in Parkdale, Hyde Park, Parkdale is the neighborhood where most Tibetans live, and we have for the last 2 decades. It is also unofficially known as Little Tibet. Sounds great. Everything's great. I mean, it's amazing. Like, you walk on Queen Street, there are like 15 Tibetan restaurants. You can see there's so many little gombas. You will see Tibetan grocery stores. You will see monks. I'm sure the experience is quite similar here in this neighborhood. But even if you just look at my constituency in one district, I represent over 100,000 people. The Tibetan community is about 4,000. And perhaps those who actually have citizenship and is eligible to vote will probably be half of that. Maybe I'm just approximating numbers here, 2,000. I have a constituency of over 100,000. You can do the math in terms of the size, the percentage of our community as a voting bloc, or as a community that can leverage our size in any way. And so when we start to get involved in issues beyond the Tibetan struggle, we're able to lend solidarity, and we will get solidarity in return for sure for the Tibetan struggle. But also, we're able to build that foundation where people will care about what happens to their neighbors as Tibetans. People will get to not only know about the Tibetan cause, but people will want to work for the Tibetan cause. And I think that when you are able to do that, you broaden your base, you grow your constituency. So as an elected official, if I'm listening to the Tibetan community and what the Tibetan community wants in terms of the Tibetan cause, I'm hearing from a small section. But when I hear from non-Tibetans about the Tibetan cause, all of a sudden, you've just grown that constituency, and you've also pushed ahead the priority of that issue within your community and within your elected representative's office. So working in solidarity, because we don't lead one issue lives, issues of rent, education costs, here in the United States, your healthcare costs, all of that is also impacting Tibetan people, right? And so those are things that we have common causes with our neighbors who are non-Tibetans. And those are the issues that we can get active around and build solidarity. Finally, one of the things that I wanted to share is how I have learned to work with everyone and what it means in terms of the Tibetan cause. As I mentioned earlier, I was elected deputy speaker, and that required the support of everybody, all political parties. I've done 2 elections now with my party, and in both the elections, I obviously personally won my seat, but my party, we lost both elections. We formed the official opposition. And in both the elections, the Conservative Party, they got majorities. So we are operating in a majority Conservative government. And as an elected official who sits in the opposition side, it's much, much harder to get anything passed because we don't hold government, because we don't hold power. And so we have to find ways in which we can work with the government side, with technically your opponent, right? In moving our own goals ahead. And it is because I was able to work across party lines that we managed to pass the Tibetan Heritage Month Act in 2021. And similarly, beyond the legislation, one of the things that I have been able to start in the legislature is the Ontario Parliamentary Friends of Tibet Summer Internship Program for young Tibetan students. So I don't know if you are familiar with the program. Essentially, students, undergraduate or graduate, or even recent graduates, can apply to work as part of the program in an elected official's office. And it's a paid position for starters. It's always good to be paid. It's a kind of learning that cannot happen unless you're there, you know? And it's part of the reason why it's been so hard to write about what happens inside political offices and the inner workings. You have to learn and live it, really, experience it from the inside. And so that's one of our goals is to place students so that they have that experience, they have that learning. And I'm very proud actually to share that graduates of that program have gone on to their own impressive careers, have stayed politically active. We had one student who went to go on to work for the federal government in a political party, and then now works in the Chamber of Commerce. We have another student who got politically active but decided to take her politics into medical school and intersect health and politics, in terms of what she wanted to do career-wise. And when I think about that, I realize this is what His Holiness has been saying all along, right? And this is why His Holiness has been making such an effort to reach out to the Chinese community. That is why there are so many times, and in fact, every time His Holiness does visits, I certainly know that in the US and in Canada, when His Holiness used to come, if there was an opportunity to engage with Chinese students, with the Chinese community, he always prioritized that because he stressed on dialogue. This is exactly the same thing. Working with others, people who disagree with you essentially sometimes, right? But finding a way where we can find that common ground to work. It was almost like a light bulb goes off in your mind. It's like, oh my gosh, yes, this is what His Holiness was doing. You're able to understand that no matter in any aspect, especially when it comes to politics, because people feel so opinionated about politics, people feel very passionate about politics. More and more, we tend to not look outward. We tend not to talk with people we disagree with. We just want to surround ourselves with people who agree with you and live in our own little bubbles, in our echo chambers, which actually fuels division even more, right? So it's so important that we talk to people. It's so simple, just talking to people, especially for whom you may have differing opinions, disagreements, but trying to work things out. That's another thing that I have found increasingly important to do, not only in my role, but I think is also very relevant to us as Tibetans. So those are some of the lessons I've learned so far. Really it has been not only driven by the experiences I've had, the journey I've had in politics, but also really the lessons have been such that it has reinforced in me or confirmed for me things that my pala amlan, kundi, our elders in the community have said all along. They want us to work hard. They want us to work with others. They want us to persevere. Because this is how we even reached here in the first place. It's because our parents and grandparents who came before us, who lived through the migration experience from Tibet, through India, Nepal, and finally here in North America. If they didn't persevere, we wouldn't be here, right? So it's almost like a cyclical thing. It's like our parents went through it, they imparted that lesson. We are going through it in a different way, through different experiences, but it's the same lessons. I'm open to questions now. I hope that was helpful in terms of sharing with all of you some of the things that I think could be helpful, particularly for young people in our community. Should I come down or stay here? Oh, stay.
Bhutila to Chishwin. Tanda the color of the Dutch area, numbers money, Bhutila money, Mixegi, Totida, and the Rena de Chick, a co-op share Chishwin. How about the Shunye Kasto? And Pama money, then the years of Tanda the color of December, the 10 day war arching to send with a Roger. This numbers money, Totina, Genshin soon in the Kawamido, co-op share Chishwin.
In a complex society that we live in right now, how do you find agree to disagree and to find some common grounds within the people around us?
Sure. I think one of the things that I would suggest, and I think it's important for all of us to keep in mind, is most of the time, maybe subconsciously, maybe unknowingly, we make assumptions about people, right? And it's really those assumptions we make about people that magnify differences. But when you actually talk to the person, we're all human beings. We all are driven by the need to have, basic necessities of life, respect, live in dignity. And so I feel that a lot can be done. You can move ahead quite a bit if you simply check yourself and remind yourself not to make those assumptions and actually just talk to the person. And maybe after talking to the person, you will find, key differences that you might be, issues that you might disagree on, but I can almost bet you that you will also find a lot of things you do agree on. And when you do find those commonalities, that's your starting point of working together and trying to come to an agreement for the good of not just yourselves, but for the community. So dropping that assumption about people is very, very important.
Just naming la NG children permanent so get and it's also language here. Jidon and the permit but Chinese socialia, Chizonalia, Tundu Zamatanya Muta, and Tonang Mambuchura, Tanda. Digi and Tuador Karina. Magic Tendeki, Chizo Kongaya, Tundu Zamane, Chiki and the Peme Mambuchilia, Chapsiki Gallery, Peding Tolia, Chide Mambuti, in Engazuki, Chizo Nimbeki, Chik Tawachiki, Digi, and Chik Pemela, the Ani Nangayapoda, Puguyapoda, the Chikta, Semeda, Kesia, Gangla, Tundu Zamane, Delia, Chik Tida Mangushki Ajora, Ani Puguda, Kawada, Nangida, and Chik Shenada, Senada, the Mambu Chiking and Zuki. The Luni Pemedia, Langduza money and Deleagic Matewa shoes and Pomedi Langduza money and Delea Shinagi Tida Tapatamos soon in Kearney and Yados Chin Lang to Takashi, Shiolagic Lagri, Kashi Shiol Ni Lagata, Susul Nazos, Miss Shimpagic Tagis, Pemedi Langaro, Mola Jenang Tongiori, She to Giori, Level Pejutang to go, Tangi Koranzoliaji, the Campi Jubudo, the Chetuda, that the Ganglia Shield, oh, Shiola Miki Chicla, Pemedi Denzula, Susuki, Nuba. The leader child do and dig Koranzolia that Sim Shupa regiment, Delia, Chikadis, Tick, Sungu, and Koranzola. kita kami nanglo lagi kita mampu pe di harusnya point di tira da mau mengarai peje tengah lah cik consistency tu ya jadi susu kita kat di mutu ni jo jadi zaman ini konda cidang liya musim baca ya mas di lucu kita nanglo da longa kita liya tu sekali kayak gitu lah di susu kita liya minggu di sini dia ni dia fight cie di kecung gue baca tongsa tapi ini kita ya pemeh di dia liya cik 소소리 니버 유연이야 람 하도니 직 지속이 지금 마텐데 요디게 들려는 수수기네 람도도 심시 버려야 직 지카시 송로 나슈에
Listen, Krishna. Did you already pay? Yes, Samala. Kachumbu Tongodo. The answer part ni chigi kachin sinachik around so community nang lola ya struggles yorwa women's equity gichedu. Niba the yeah within the larger system, right? Pichashina manzu Canadian politics la. Women representation about 30% chukule yore, you know. So we still have a lot of way to go to get equal representation. Ani Nanzuki to actually have representation that reflects the size of the population. So first, tanda kanzu community ki aspect ita dungala. At some do like okay, pina ngach dawo chikina. I think, okay, I'm gonna do it, and then I just go for it, right? I don't spend so much time thinking about, oh, like, how will it look, who's gonna pull me back, all of that. But then I think, how did I come to the point where in my mind, I don't factor that in, you know? And I think it's because my Amala was very, very strong woman, and she was strong because my Momala was a very, very strong woman. When my Momala came from Tibet, she came by herself with 4 daughters. She didn't have her husband, my Momala. He was still in Phe, right? So she was a single mother who raised 4 daughters. And because of the experiences, because of you know, just the fact that as a woman, she now had to take care of her family of 4 daughters in a patriarchal society meant that she had to really toughen up. And she did that, and she passed on that strength to her daughters. And through her, my Amala got it, and I got it. And I think that that's where it is that if we want to really bring about change within our community, then we have to let girls and young women get more freedom and independence to do what they want, to pursue anything that interests them. And it is empowering the next generation of young people and giving our own daughters. I have a daughter too, right? If I want my daughter to not experience, and I'm saying this especially for the palas in this room, you know, the men of our community. Empower your child, especially your daughter, you know, and do not have that judgment, because if they grow up thinking that they can do whatever they want and they get that support from the family members, especially your parents and your elders in the community, if our elders of our community are supportive of that, as opposed to judgmental or even trying to cast doubt, you know, there'll always be naysayers, but as much as possible, proactively in small decisions, because when you think about it, you know, for your daughters, especially for little girls, something small that you just give them the ability to make decisions for themselves in ways that, you know, might help them in building decision capacity. I think that kind of work of really starting young and building it within our families for the next generation is really what's going to tackle the inequities we see within our community, especially against women. And I think that for me personally, even though within the family front, I've always had that support from my family and my parents especially. Going out into the real world is a different story, right? I'll tell you one story quickly. So in 2018, when I first got elected, we had a new members orientation. And I went into the floor of the House, everybody was there. And you know, we're new, we're excited, we're trying to get to know everybody. It was also the year when there was a record number of new members because there was a change in the government, the party which won power. I think it was about more than 70 new members. And I went in and I thought, okay, this is a clean slate, I'm going to say hi to everybody, I'm going to introduce myself and, you know, start on a good right note, on a good front. And I started to introduce myself to all of the government, the conservative members as well. And there was one representative who is of Chinese heritage, a gentleman. And I introduced myself to him and I said, hi, I'm Bhutila Karpoche, Parkdale Hyde Park. That's my district name. And he said, ah, you're the 5th Chinese. I said, no, I'm the 1st Tibetan. And this is after already it being in the news that, oh, you know, 1st Tibetan elected. You know, imagine the audacity to say that to me after all of that. And I thought, okay, it took a while for me to unpack that interaction. And I realized, okay, there's so much going on in here. Well, first of all, you know, maybe he's trying to undermine, you know, my heritage as a Tibetan. Maybe second, he thinks he can say it because I'm a woman, right? There's that aspect of it too. And then I realized, you know, okay, this is my first date. This is orientation. And I'm already starting to experience this kind of, you know, negative interactions with my own colleagues. I can't imagine what's going to come. And moving forward, you realize that especially in systems like we have in North America, these are colonial systems, right? And so these are systems that are designed, to uphold power for certain groups of people and not for others. And I think for immigrants, for racialized immigrants particularly, for women, for young women, these are systems that when you get in, it's not only, first of all, so hard to get into it, but once you're in it, it's a system that wants to chew you up and spit you out. That's how I describe it. Because in your interactions, but also in the policies and procedures of a place, is designed not to support women. And you experience that in big ways, but also you experience that in what we call micro systems, like micro interactions, right? And so it takes a lot of, I would say, not only sort of guts to be in a place, but it is really, really important, especially as women, to know that you have the support of other women in that, if you're operating within that system, right? There will be times, and I've had many of that of my own, where you are just worn down, you're exhausted from such heavy burden that you have to carry. Like you feel like you're fighting at every front. You know, like every time you want to do something, somebody wants to take you down. You know, those things happen constantly. It's almost like this force that is trying to push you back. But where the two things that I draw strength from is, one, always reminding myself why I'm here in the first place, why the work has to be done, why somebody like me or a Tibetan voice has to be here to do that for our community. So reminding yourself of the why. And secondly, and I tell this all the time to a lot of young women particularly, is be there for one another. If you experience any kind of discrimination, and especially if I witness it, anybody, if it's done in a way, or if I learn about it, if I stand up for you, then you get strength, right? So, but if I don't say anything, then my silence is enabling that situation. So I think it's very important, particularly for us as women, to be there for one another and to support each other.